Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Season 4 of Magic in the Room. I am Luke Freeman.
And I'm Chris Province.
And I am Hannah Broderud. We are super excited about this new season. New topics, new guests, and kind of a new format. So today we're starting a 3-part series on the topic of intentional leadership. And I just want to let everyone know, as part of this kind of new format, we're also providing some great resources for our listeners. So there's a free guide that goes along with this episode that will help you to apply these concepts of intentional leadership as we talk about your own leadership journey. It'll help you reflect and take notes, and you can use it for yourself or with your team. So in order to get that guide, go check out magicintheroom.com. And you'll be able to get this guide along with other free resources for our episodes going forward.
Yeah, and I'm super excited about this season and just helping people apply what we talk about on the show to their personal leadership journeys. You know, we're, whatever it is, 150 episodes in. And so for Season 4, we really wanted to take it up a notch. And I think we've figured out how to do that. And yeah, just if you're interested at all in what we do, we've tried to create some huge value for you and your journey by checking out the downloads. And they're really like fillable worksheets, you know, where you can follow along and apply principles and have a written version of some of the things that we talk about. So enjoy.
You bet. And I think that's us attempting to model the way, as we've moved season to season, continuing to ratchet up our intentionality and provide more and more value to the folks that connect with us and have conversations with us every day. So this is good stuff. I'm excited. It's great to be in Hannah's home state recording today. We're coming live from Big Sky, Montana. Beautiful place, lots of snow this time of year. But I'm excited to dig into our topic today. So as Hannah mentioned, this is the first of a 3-part series on intentional leadership, which we've been working hard to define and put content around over the last few years. But let's just start with super simple principle. And we talk about intention or intentionality. We talk about that a lot, but let's take a moment to establish some language and some shared understanding. Like, what does that mean? What is intentionality?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it starts with purpose. It's being purposeful, right? Having a clear understanding of why we're doing this thing in the first place, or being purposeful about my response rather than just reacting and being reactionary to any impulse or stimulus that comes along. So for me, it has to do with choosing a response or choosing an action with purpose rather than just out of default.
Yeah, for me, I just think about the word self-determination. And how do we move from others influencing us to primarily influencing our own choice and our own decision making and our own path in life? And as a social psychology kind of geek, and I love learning about how the environments we create organizationally can give rise to behaviors, and even culturally, whenever we go to the grocery store and whenever we're out to the movies, like just the things that happen. I mean, everyone facing one direction in the elevator. Our behavior oftentimes is directed by just the norms and expectations of whatever situation we happen to be in. And I think intentionality for me is the ability to pause, look at all of that and say, okay, which direction am I going to stand? Where am I going to go? What am I going to say to this person? And really, being self-determined, like going where I want to go, not necessarily where all the context and systems want me to go.
Yeah, and I want to take that and spin it into being deliberate, right? So being deliberate on what I'm, to your point, Luke, what am I trying to make happen? how does that align with my purpose? And am I making intentional decisions about what I'm delivering,
Mm-hmm.
how I'm responding, and what I'm consuming?
Mm-hmm.
And so if I can deliberate around those things and really what am I deliberating? How those things align with who I want to be or
Yeah.
how I want to show up.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, a nice introduction to this idea of intentionality. And it's being deliberate or purposeful about the world that we want to create and the people that we want to become.
Yeah. I just
Yeah.
want to layer on one more metaphor there. Like, I think about this term architecting our own lives. And if you think about someone who's intentional, like really being the architect of their own lives and their journey and their influence and where they're going to go, like being an architect requires work. You know, an architect doesn't magic a building into existence. They really work hard on what are the desires of the homeowner, or what are the codes in the area that I'm building in. And I think for us, like, it's hard work to architect our own life.
Yeah.
And it takes time set apart, saying, what am I trying to build here? And what are the creative ways that I can get to what I want?
Right. And so what happens, I mean, I think it's helpful to call out, what happens when we're not intentional.
Yeah.
And so what's involved with that? Like when we're not intentional, what happens?
Well, a lot of things happen on accident when we're not intentional. We might succeed on accident, but we don't necessarily know why we succeeded or why we ended up that way. Or we may end up being very reactive and not end up somewhere on purpose. That's kind of the biggest thing that I think of is if I'm not intentional about how I show up, I can't manage the perception of me, my actions, because I haven't thought about it. And there's a lot of fallout that comes from that. That's unintended, a lot of unintended consequences.
There we go.
Yeah. Well, when I take my kids to school, the route is the same to get to all the schools until one stop sign. And then the route diverges to go to the high school or to the middle school, the intermediate school. And I've got a kid in each of those places. And more than once, I have pulled up to that stop sign, just kept going to the intermediate school when what I needed to do, like there's no intermediate kid in the back seat. It's a high schooler in the back seat. I should have turned. And so we all experience this when I'm driving. I forget where I'm going and I lose track of time and, oh, how did I get here? But the same is true in our life. When we're on autopilot, which isn't a bad thing. It's efficient for us to learn routes and do some things on autopilot. But when we do that, we miss a turn. And missing turns in life are way higher consequences than missing turn taking my kid to school, right? Because I can always backtrack and maybe the impact is a couple minutes difference. But in life, if I'm just on cruise control and I miss an opportunity or I miss a turn that I could have made, I want to respond differently to this conflict than I've responded to other conflicts in the past, right? Missing that opportunity is way more than a 2-minute detour, right? That could shape direction of your life. And so, intentionality, I think, is all around just like, which direction am I going? When I see that I'm at an intersection, I stop, I take, a real look at where am I trying to go so that I'm not just on cruise control.
Sure. And I think that idea, Hannah, when you speak of like unintended consequence, when we don't deliberate or have considered decisions, a lot of times that consequence includes suffering,
Yeah.
right? And unnecessary suffering.
Right.
Yeah.
If we were deliberate, if we were considered, we avoid unnecessary suffering.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge role for us as leaders of communities, families, organizations, teams. Like, let's avoid the unnecessary suffering because there should be enough necessary suffering
Right.
architecting the things
Yeah.
and
Right.
building the things
Right.
that we need to get the unnecessary expense, the unnecessary emotion, the unnecessary physical load. We need to get that out of the environment.
Well, I even think about suffering is something we can be intentional about
Right.
as well.
Right.
How do we respond to hardship? How do we respond when things don't go our way or how we expected it, or life takes a left turn that you didn't see coming, right? There are plenty of opportunities for suffering in life. Let's be intentional about avoiding unnecessary suffering. And also let's be intentional about how we do respond in times of suffering. How are we reacting out of fear, frustration, anger? And all of those emotions are valid and legitimate. And ignoring them isn't helpful. Being aware of them and paying attention to them, and then choosing a response rather than just reacting out of our default sort of, we get triggered by a situation and we have a certain way that we tend to react. And we'll talk more in coming, series on this in the season about what happens when we're under stress and how we respond, right? But there is a choice there. Viktor Frankl talked about that space in between stimulus and response. There's a choice. So there's incoming stimulus. And if we can create a little bit more space before we react and choose a response and recognize that we have a choice, right? And we recognize that by being able to slow that reaction time down a little bit and being deliberate about how we respond in a certain situation, we can avoid a lot of unintended consequences for ourselves and others.
Yeah. And so I just want to take a moment and put a little bit of a bow around that. This idea, every decision we make has an expense.
Mm-hmm.
Intentional decisions have an expense, and unintentional decisions have an expense. Which expense is easier to bear?
Yeah.
And what is preferred for us to work through in this game of life?
Well, and the difference is you're better able to account for the cost of intentional decisions.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's talk about, what can intentional leaders accomplish? What's that differentiation? What can intentional leaders do that transactional leaders may struggle with? So I'll throw that out there for us to chew on.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is pivot and be creative and innovate faster. So, I'm going to use just old school. Someone has a product, they look out at the market, they figure out what price will people pay for this, and they just say, okay, how efficiently can I create this product? How much can I get the word out to people, right? That is a recipe in a lot of ways for unintentional days. I'm recreating something that just happens, and I know the formula for how it happens. And so I just focus on efficiency of the formula. And what we see is that when most leadership teams kind of actually pause and say, what's going well, what's not going well, what's happening in the market, what's happening with our team members, things come up, like inevitably things come up in the conversation that they have not been addressing. Oh, our engagement is down. Oh, we have this competitor that's coming in. Oh, we haven't capitalized appropriately. Like these things that they just haven't done that are almost like head slappers because it's obvious that this operational or this strategic thing needs to happen, but no one actually stopped and thought about it. Everyone was so busy doing the work every day. No one stepped back and thought about it. And so to me, this practice of stepping back and thinking about it from an organizational perspective, but also as an individual leader, for myself, if I don't make a habit and a practice of doing that, I am going to miss what would seem to others from an outside perspective as obvious strategic pivots or innovative things that I should be doing.
Excellent. So innovation, movement, alignment. Yeah. Hannah, what's your take?
Yeah, I think intentional leaders are more likely or better able to create transformation, be transformational rather than transactional, simply, going through the motions and transacting leadership. We can, when we're intentional, create transformation in individuals, or at least create the conditions where transformation can happen, whether that's for the individuals we lead, for our teams, for our organizations, for the products that we develop and launch, and what an impact. And that's really what it comes down to. We, as intentional leaders, we can be intentional about the kind of impact we want to make on the world, on one individual, on a team, an organization, a community, a city, a state, the nation, or the world, right? You take it wherever you want to take it. But as truly intentional leaders, I think we're able to have a greater impact and are more set up to be in a transformational space.
Absolutely. And that's very aligned with where I'm at on it. It's transformation, or intentional leaders are able to achieve that greatest possible good because they understand what the greatest possible good is.
Yeah.
So it is more likely for an intentional leader to achieve kind of their moral intent and how they want to show up and impact the world, because they're able to align their behaviors with their values, because they're explicit about what they are. That's part of being intentional.
Yeah.
So,
well,
go ahead.
Just an illustration of that, when we think about the Great Resignation, and what I think a lot of people have experienced is kind of this reckoning of people's relationship with work over the last few years. I think the pandemic created space for reflection and clarification of values. And I think it made it much more tangible for people to see where what they were doing every day didn't align with their values, and gave them time to think through, what's my plan to align what I do every day with what I truly value, what my core values are. So that's kind of one interpretation of what caused a lot of that upheaval, all of that job mobility, whatever. I really think it was intentionality, like a leveling up of intentionality for all these individuals who now all of a sudden they're like, wait a second, like I've been living with what I do every day, not aligned with what I believe. And how am I going to fix that?
Yeah. What came to mind for me, Luke, was you and I spent last couple of days with one of our clients at an offsite leadership retreat. And the outcome of those 2 days together was a really clearly articulated purpose statement. And it's not like this organization hasn't been living that purpose all along. In fact, when the founder who was in the room, we kind of checked for alignment on what we had kind of created as a team in terms of our purpose. He looked at it and he said, well, this is exactly what we've been doing for 30 years.
Yeah.
We've just never been able to truly articulate it. And just the level of energy and momentum that happened with that team when we were able to say, this is our purpose. And with that, we created a really clearly articulated, intentional, strategic vision for this year that everybody stacked hands on, we're excited about. And the rest of the strategic planning with that team was so much easier because we had agreed on, yes, this is our purpose. We know which direction we're headed on in the long term. And we know what we need to do this year in order to move that purpose forward. And I'm just excited to continue working into this year with that level of intentionality for this team.
Yeah.
Because it is going to transform how this team shows up, how they pull together, how they focus their efforts. Because we know, it's become clear, and we can now be intentional about that.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is it was easy in that the right direction for this year became very clear and apparent, but it's also enables hard decisions because, being committed to the priority for this year means that we're not committed to all the ancillary priorities and ideas and things that we could be doing.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, being intentional, reflecting, knowing what our purpose is, it does allow us to, well, it looks like I have to make this my first priority, and also gives us the guts and the internal fortitude, I guess, to say, I'm sorry, I just can't do that other thing right now because I'm really clear what my priority is.
Right. And so I want to bring that home and say, like, this is why intentional leadership is important. You're able to put the stake in the ground and saying, we are making claim to this. This is our rallying cry. This is the idea we're forging around. And that allows us to synchronize the efforts of the people in our community or on our team while adjusting to the needs of those around that are forged.
Yeah.
Right. Whether that's the market, needs of the team members, what have you, but having that central idea and being intentional about how we advance that is absolutely why it's important. So let's get into tactics and really think through, okay, what are the tactics that intentional leaders use? Luke, I know this was a very considered thing from our team and dug into a lot of the research, but what are the tactics that intentional leaders use to advance their position?
Well, I want to go back to what Hannah said about, just the quote from Viktor Frankl. And can you probably know it word for word better than me. Like, what was the quote again?
I don't think I know it word for word, but the gist of it is, in the space between stimulus and response, there's a space.
Uh-huh.
And then in that space is effectively what allows us to be intentional, right? That's not
choice.
exactly how he said it, but there's a choice, right? There's a choice on how we respond.
Yeah. And I think for everyone listening, and I know for me, hearing that, in between stimulus and response, there is a space where choice can happen. It's like, well, yeah, duh, but the doing is way harder than that concept. And I think we all know that because we all do get into that autopilot mode so easily and go through so much of our lives just like, well, this is what I do. And this is the things I spend my time doing. And so when we get into tactics here, like, what is intentional leadership? I want you to hear, if you're listening, this is a way for you to learn how to actually tactically capture that space of choice. And this is not rocket science, but it is a practice that is simple.
It's
but
social
hard.
science, and it's a lot harder than rocket science.
Yes,
exactly.
because it deals with humans and not math.
Yeah, but it's just this. We like to break it down into a 3-step process, and the steps are notice, choose, and act. And we'll talk about each of those, but that's essentially what that choice is. It's noticing that a choice is before us, that a stimulus has come in, and then actually aligning our options, thinking about our options and aligning this option is best aligned with my purpose or where I want to go or what I want to achieve here. And then the third step is acting and just having the courage to act. And so often we do the first two, but then we get afraid and we don't actually execute and act to make a change. Before we jump into that more, I just want to say the simplicity is on purpose. Because when we talk about what is leadership, historically, there have been a lot of answers to that. Well, a leader has these traits. They're this tall and they have this color skin and they have this educational background. And then there's been, will they use these tactics or these methodologies? Or a leader has charisma, or a leader scores this on, the 5 domains of their personality. But what we really embrace and advocate for is this idea that everyone can be a leader and that leadership is within reach for every single person, whether they're a line cook or whether they're in the CEO's chair. And by saying all intentional leadership is noticing that there's a choice right now, making an intentional choice that aligns with our values, and then having the courage to act. That's something that applies equally to the person in the kitchen choosing how to prioritize what orders or how they talk to their supervisor or how they build a relationship with their peers, or how they want to shape their career moving forward, all the way to someone in the CEO seat who's saying, I have a choice to make here. What are my options? How do we move forward?
And at the very core, every single individual is responsible for leading themselves. And that's where leadership starts, is by leading yourself. And until we master self-leadership, really, we should not be leading others.
Yeah, red flag, yellow flag, all the flags, right? So much of our space, especially in people development, leadership development, it's just this one big bucket, right? And it really is a scaffold. Lead yourself, learn how to lead teams, learn how to develop leaders, then learn how to lead organizations. The idea that all of this can exist within one shared space, it is literally impossible.
Yeah.
But that's why scaffolding, curriculum, coaching, all of those things play a role with really effective people development programs. And I understand, like, it doesn't contain the efficiency that a lot of business leaders want, but that's why there's so much waste within the development and training industry, is because we don't take the time to do it appropriate, which is not efficient, because we're talking about people, can't be mechanized. But I'm excited about where the science is going and what we're learning about what effective people development looks like.
Yeah, and I just want to give an illustration there. This idea that leading ourselves is central. I think it's just an admission that the way we manage our own lives has bearing on how effective we are at leading others.
Sure.
And for whatever reason, here we are in history, in a marketplace that does not penalize individual leaders whenever they can't lead themselves. Right? So we see executives who are paid $500,000 a year fail publicly in their personal life and retain their seat at the C-suite. And so what we're saying here is different from that. It's saying that something about how we lead ourselves will influence all the other people that we lead.
Yeah.
And I'll make it less about, pointing my finger at other people and more about myself. If you're watching the video, like, Hannah has things figured out, with her physical health, obviously. Chris and I, like, we're big guys, and we've had this conversation around, like, there is a level of physical health that we have to work to maintain to have any credibility to stand up and talk to people about leadership. Because if I obviously visually can't even lead myself enough to not get myself sick, then what right do I have to tell other people how to be intentional leaders? And so this is also an admission, like, yes, anyone can be an intentional leader. The line cook, bring it on, right? You can lead yourself. And there's some accountability there. If you call yourself a leader and want to be someone who's intentional, like, you have to lead yourself first.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And okay, so I love the idea, like, this is broken down really simply. Notice, choose, act. What are we noticing? What choices are we really processing? And then I'd like to get into how do we action the activity? Because I think there's courage components to that. There's some environmental components to consider. But let's just start with, okay, what are we noticing?
Yeah, and that's where it all starts, right? Because we can't all notice everything all the time. And in a future episode, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what are the different factors. In fact, in subsequent episodes, we're going to look at lots of different factors that impact what we notice and why, right? But ultimately, what we notice has to do with our experiences. What do we have eyes for? What is something that I've become aware of, either because it's a natural part of my personality to pay attention to certain things, or because I've had experiences that make it impossible not to see some things, right? When you have seen something, when you have eyes for something, when something's become explicit to you, you can't unsee what you've seen, right? And yet there's whole swaths of reality that we walk around completely blind to because we're not noticing. And part of that is simple brain efficiency. Luke, you alluded to that earlier, that being on autopilot is very efficient for our brains, right? Because any focus is the most energy costly thing we can do. The brain is generally 2% of our body weight, but takes up 20% of the energy resources that we use. And a lot of that energy resource goes to paying attention. And so what we pay attention to becomes really critical because we can't pay attention to everything all the time.
Yeah. And noticing requires learning. I will say there's not I'm just going to decide I'm going to notice when I'm getting ready to have a conflict because then I'll act differently. Like, it's not that simple. We have to learn something new usually. So I'll give an example. I taught outdoor education for many years in the Ozarks, and Ozark Mountains, Northeast Oklahoma, Northwest Arkansas, Missouri, like lots of poison ivy. It's lots of places if you've been there. So watch out if you visit. But, my job was to keep people safe. And part of my job was actually to teach people what poison ivy looks like. So, there's what shape are the leaves and how does it grow and how do you identify it? And I spent so much time in the woods and taught people how to identify poison ivy so often that if I'm hiking or I'm out in my yard and there is poison ivy within my vicinity, I can't not see it.
Right.
It's like it's painted a different color. And that's very hard to describe, but if I'm hiking with a group, it's literally like pointing off to the left. Hey, there's some poison ivy there. Pointing up to the right. Hey, watch out there. It's grown over the trail. And it's like it's a different color. And I can't unsee that. And I think that's what, for all of us, noticing things requires that learning and that practice to say, oh, this situation with my boss, the flag's going up. It's like it's a different color. I can see it. Now I have a conscious choice to make about how I interact with this.
Yeah.
Or here is a project that we're rolling out. Okay, well, I've thought about enough and I've learned enough about project management and maybe how we've failed in the past that I can't help but notice that there is a choice here on how we resource this and how we document it and how we stand up a stakeholder team, whatever, I almost can't help but notice. And so, my goal as a leader is how do I notice more and more and more and more? How do I learn more and more and more and more so I become more aware of every context I'm in and become more able to make that conscious choice?
That's powerful. And think about that too when it comes to what do I notice internally about myself? And how do we learn to notice? You talked about physical health and physiology. Am I paying attention to what my body is telling me right now? Am I paying attention? Am I noticing how I'm feeling? Because our emotions are that kind of silent driver of all of our behavior. And if we don't pay attention to that, emotion is information. They're important data points. They are messengers. They're not dictators. But if we don't notice how we feel, how are we going to be intentional about how we manage?
But I think a lot of times we do notice how we feel and we don't do anything anyway.
Yeah.
Like something's given me dissonance, right? Basically, I see this thing and it gives me the feeling, but I don't act on it.
Right.
Right. And so
or I just ignore it.
So I want to bring it back kind of top level here. What we're talking about is noticing that something can be better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. We should feel that dissonance. We should feel like, hey, I know that can be better.
Yep.
Then we have these possible choices to evaluate on how we could make that so. And really narrowing it down to say, well, here's my range of decisions. Here's the most optimal outcomes. Like, I would like to make this decision.
Mm-hmm.
And then we act to make it so.
Yeah.
Right? So, highest level, that's really the process we're talking about. Notice something can be better. Choose to make it so.
Mm-hmm.
And then action or create all the activity that corrects the defect.
Yeah. And notice that something can be better. And also noticing that you do have a choice. Because often in certain situations, we go on default mode because we're under the assumption that there's no other choice.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a choice. And sometimes we have to look really hard to find options.
Yeah.
But there's always a choice. And that's part of noticing as well. Noticing what choices do I have here?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not this, if it's not that, could there be a third way? Could there be some other way out of this, or some other way to respond to this, some other way to solve this problem?
Yeah.
Right. And just embrace the laws of constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We can't do these things. What can we do? And don't let perfect be the enemy of better.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think a lot of times they're like, well, if we can't make that correction or correct that defect to 100%, then we won't take any action at all, when there's actually a lot more decisions to consider. And I think when we think about our choices as a range of possible decisions with a range of possible outcomes, we can be much more effective leaders.
Yeah. I mean, I go back to the line cook, right? You know, we're kind of talking about people in leadership roles right now, but I want to go back to any individual. So say they're in a context where they notice that other people aren't following food safety handling guidelines and aren't properly sanitizing, equipment or utensils. They have a choice, right? But oftentimes we don't see that choice. I think a lot of people say, well, here we don't do that. I'm like, it's fine. It's good enough. But for someone to reflect and say, you know what, my personal standard is higher than the standards of what's happening around here, and I'm going to behave in ways that align with it. And I can only control so much, but I'm going to sanitize my utensils and equipment properly in my area at the end of every shift. And I can't control what other people do, but I can control what I do. And I think the same goes for other examples, like, do I pick up trash when I see it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I don't even notice it, really hard to make that decision. So that first step really is, do I notice that there's trash here and that there's a better world that exists where there's not trash here?
Right.
Okay, and what am I going to do about it?
Well, I think there's also those leaders that are applying like appropriate pressures within their environment to architect this system where success is happening. And there's also leaders that exist within environments where success is happening, maybe not intentionally, and it lulls them to sleep, and it makes paying attention very difficult.
Yeah.
So those are two very different types of environment. One, the performance continues to trend upward. The other, the performance will eventually trend downward. But it's this idea of we have to train, going to the savannah and trying to find wildlife. We have to train those bush eyes.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times the dangers are camouflaged into the environment. And as leaders, we have to continue to develop our ability to see those things, notice what can be better, and embrace like good enough. To your point, Luke, good enough never is. What we see and do nothing about is the operating standards for the organization.
Yeah.
And this is where I say smudgy door, smudgy brand. If there's fingerprints on the door, there might as well be toothpick wrappers at the cashier station. I probably don't want to see the kitchen. The bathrooms might as well be dirty. The lights might as well be some in, some out. It's just how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Yep.
And, maybe team members or people around us think, well, that's really splitting hairs. That's nitpicky. Well, what's the brand mean to you? Like if the enterprise we're leading is putting roofs over our heads, caring for our families, taking care of, the education of our children, like what's the brand mean to you?
Mm-hmm.
And why should we accept good enough and standards that are anything less than impeccable that create a sustainable, vibrant kind of existence for our organizations.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the root of that is leading yourself and is knowing what your personal standard is. And I think for people who are willing to stand up and say, smudgy door, smudgy brand, like, I'm going to do something about it. There's also a hidden piece in there, like that I'm not okay being associated with a brand that's smudgy.
Mm-hmm.
My personal standard is higher than that. So I'm going to act here to make a change. And, we've kind of been pulling this thread, I think, a little bit around people have this personal choice, and it takes learning to be aware and have our eyes open to what choices are before us. And so, Chris, maybe to ask a personal question, I know you've shared on the podcast before, kind of growing up in a little bit of a, rough, under-resourced context. There are a lot of people that grow up in the same place, in the same context, and don't say my standard is higher than this. So I'm curious for you what that learning journey was to say, I'm going to start noticing where I have choice to behave the status quo, maybe what was modeled, what I observed around me, or to behave in a way that aligns with my own personal standards.
Right. I think a lot of that is we all need some sort of aspirational influence.
Mm-hmm.
And we ask, like, who's been most influential in your life as far as developing your leadership style? And maybe it's your personal brand or the person that you are. It could be, it could be a youth pastor. It could be a coach. It could be a teacher. I mean, normally these are the areas, a parent, a grandparent, an uncle. These are the areas where we see a lot of that aspirational type of influence, where we learn the values and standards that we want to live by.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what starts to disappear in under-resourced environments, the number of those influences is reduced and adverse childhood events is increased, right? So there's more cynicism, there's more trepidation, there's probably, we tend to pull inside of ourselves when that's the environment. But at the end of the day, it takes some person to connect and provide an aspirational type of influence. They have a life that is like one that I want to create.
Yeah.
I admire the family they have. I admire the career they have. I can admire the house they have. Like, it's just there's something aspirational about this person that makes me want to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And that person makes me realize that I'm no different than them.
Yeah.
Right. They put me on the same plane and share with me what they understand about the world so that I can grow what feels like alongside of them.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of transactional leaders will stand on the other side of the finish line and say, I hired you to do a job. I'm over here, come across the finish line.
Mm-hmm.
When what actually needs to happen to provide that influence is the intentional leader goes and walks behind or with the person they're trying to influence and advance and give them more than a job.
Yeah.
They're trying to make a real impact on the well-being of that person. And if we as leaders can make the impact on the well-being of that one person, then we have a shot at generational impact and changing communities and really driving economic development in our region. So that kind of long answer to a short question, it takes someone to provide an aspirational, loving, and caring influence, because someone that is not loved cannot develop.
Yeah. And you mentioned modeling the way at the beginning of the episode, Chris, and that's really what it comes down to, modeling the way. And that's the external influence. The other part of it is the choice that we all get to make, right?
Mm-hmm.
Chris, you get to make a choice of being different, or making different choices than maybe your family, the environment you grew up in. Each of us have had that choice. And that's core to identity, and we get to choose that. That is one of the choices. We can notice that something can be better, and we can choose to do something about that and act on that choice. And so, and I've told this on the podcast before, but my journey with running, I did not grow up in a family of athletes. I did not participate in any athletics in school growing up. I was not anywhere near being an athlete. And it wasn't part of my identity. And I never thought about running. In fact, actually, I thought about running and decided I didn't like it. And I avoided it for a long time. And at some point, something happened in me that made that aspiration where I chose, when I looked at what do I want the second half of my life to look like? Because I can make choices now that impact that, right? If I'm intentional in leading myself, I can influence how much energy I have to continue to do the things that I love to do, how able I am to lead and make an impact, a positive impact. And that starts with how I take care of myself. So that choice became, I want to be the kind of person who runs marathons. That
Right.
was how that kind of became real to me. And then when I made that choice, that's when the action started to follow suit.
Well, and what I would call out is in both of these scenarios, whether it's you evaluating kind of, here's the first half of my life, here's what the second half I want to look like, or me going through a process with someone that loves, cares, and respects, what I may be able to become or the person that I was already.
Yeah.
There's this introspective reflection required.
Yeah.
And if we're not reflecting, I think it makes it really difficult to be intentional, because you think about where all those intentions come from. Right? It comes from introspection and creating space for those decisions. So as we think about this idea of being an intentional leader, notice something that could be better, understanding the choices that are available for us to make, and then actioning the desired outcome. Reflection is a piece of that.
Yep.
Taking all the available data in and then ultimately taking action. But I think we've really set the table here to continue this conversation around intentional leadership. And as we exit this space today, I just want to capture any final thoughts that you guys might have around this idea and, what considerations our listeners or the people that we're connected to can take from the conversation today.
Yeah, the thing that is going to stick with me is that word picture that you made a few minutes ago about the leader who has crossed the finish line in some ways. And rather than standing on the other side of the finish line and shouting directions at people, come on, get here. Why can't you get here? Do your job, is willing to go back on the course of play, right? Go back along the race course, link up with someone and help them navigate their way to the finish line. I think that's a really powerful picture. And I think I was like, yes, that's what I believe. That's what I value. That is a really great way to say it, because, we all come to this with things that are central to who we are. And I think one thing that we share and that Purpose and Performance Group shares and that we talk about on the podcast is this really desire for transformational leaders that help people holistically transform and advance and evolve and make this world a better place than where they found it. Not people who get theirs first and then are fine and not bothered by that. And so, that's going to stick with me. I think this idea of reflection is critical to progression. Is just a truth about life. For whatever reason, we as human beings, when we reflect, we learn and advance. And I encourage people listening to, do the download and use some reflection time and walk through Notice, Choose, Act and apply those concepts. And good things will emerge if we take the time to do that.
You bet.
Yeah. For me, final thoughts really is around, if we say notice and we notice something that could be better, we recognize that we have choices in the matter. The final piece of that is action. If we notice and choose, but don't act, no change happens. Nothing happens. And so whether it's leading ourselves, leading a team, leading an organization, if we don't take action on the things that we notice and recognize that we have choice about, nothing happens. And so I want to encourage each of you to take action, because we don't learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on our experience. So go to or go to magicintheroom.com and download the personal reflection guide. Take some action today on how you are going to continue to lead yourself and the people around you.
Yeah. And for me, I think these notions of just being considerate, being deliberate, being purposeful, understanding where we are and who we are, and being courageous enough to create the outcomes for the world that we want to create. That's the idea of intentional leadership. And I'm glad to be on that journey with you all, and feel so grateful for everybody that's connected with us and listens to the podcast, or our client partners we get to work with every day. It's an amazing space to be in, and it's a space that has a ton of traction. So I love that. Thank you guys for spending this time today.
This season's going to be awesome.
Right?
I'm excited.
This is
for
an
it.
awesome kickoff to it.
If this is any indication, we're on the right track.
It might be the coffee, but I'm just like, yes, this is going to be a great season. So I'm excited.
You
Luke,
bet.
You're funny.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I really needed to hear that.
Well, you, Hannah, you want to sing us out? Tell us how we got here today and who's responsible for making all the magic happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Braderud, and Luke Freeman. It is produced by Ben West, social media support by Emma Holland and Michael Manfredi. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm. You can find his music on Apple Music. This episode was recorded on site in Big Sky, Montana. Magic in a Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. Find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. You can find previous episodes at magicintheroom.com.